So when I was a child, my great hero was Davy Crockett. And the reason why Davy Crockett was my hero was in kindergarten. Looking back, I'm not really sure exactly what the thinking behind this was. They showed us the John Wayne Alamo movie in kindergarten as a way to teach us history. Which it's a perfectly clean movie. I mean, it's fine, but a lot of people died violently in this movie. And a bunch of 6-year-olds are watching a rather adult movie in that respect. But for whatever reason, it caught on with me. And me and my buddies would get together, we'd go out and we'd play Alamo every day. We had this slide out there that was basically, it looked kind of like an Alamo. And we would all go out there and we'd play in the Alamo. We'd fight over who gets to be who, but I was always Davy Crockett. I mean, definitely. And unfortunately, we had one little Hispanic friend that we always tried to force to be Santa Anna's Army. We didn't realize the concept of racism at that time, so we're forgiven, I think. But what would happen is that I wanted to be this guy. I wanted to be Davy Crockett. And part of it was in the movie, it was John Wayne. I mean, he was the larger-than-life picture of the guy, but it was what happened in the movie. It was the fact that Davy Crockett comes out of nowhere, and he's this big hero, and everybody's looking to him, and it was his death in the movie. And while it's debated historically how he actually died, the fact of the matter is, in this movie, the thing that made me fall in love with Davy Crockett was the fact that the battle's raging, he knows he can't win, and so what he does is he's stabbed, he's bleeding, he's hurt, he's about to die. He grabs a torch and he blows up the munitions and dies while doing it so that Santa Anna's Army cannot take their munitions. He gave his life so that his brothers, who he knew would be fighting later for freedom in Texas, would not be damaged by the weapons left behind. I love that. I love that he was this character who stood for something, that he was willing to fight for something. And I went back and I would start watching the Disney movies about Davy Crockett with Fess Parker as Davy Crockett. And I loved them, but not as much because they were a little bit more Disneyfied, you know. They weren't quite as And a few years ago, I got to watch the modern version of the Alamo where Billy Bob Thornton plays Davy Crockett. And it was yet another look at this guy who recognized his celebrity and recognized his stature and who he was and was sometimes burdened by it. Great movie. A lot of people didn't like it, but I loved it. I thought it was really good. But the reason why I identified with Davy Crockett was he stood for something. Now, what I discovered as I got older was there were a lot of nuances to what the true Davy Crockett was all about. I didn't realize that he had been a senator, that he'd been in Congress, that he'd fought in these wars before that, but then he'd gone off and he'd become a politician. And I was reading some of his quotes today, and I'm going, man, if he were alive, I'd vote for him today. I like what he stood for. Good stuff. But then I ran across this one quote a few years ago, and I'm so glad I'm going to get to use it tonight, because it stands up for what he believed in. He had been fighting for the United States government to protect the Texans. He had been fighting in Congress for them to send troops to help them out because he believed that the people in Texas, the Americans who had migrated to Texas, were being abused by the Mexican government. And he wanted them to be supported by the rest of the country. But nobody would go for it. Nobody would fight for it. Nobody would stand up. And he grew increasingly frustrated with the red tape and the bureaucracy of the politics in Washington. And he decided that he was going to take a stand for freedom, what he believed to be was true freedom. And so he says this one day. He stands up before Congress and he says, "You can go to hell, I will go to Texas." Now, it sums up the character of this mountain man, of this backwoods guy who said, basically, I don't care what you do, I'm going to stand for something. I am going to risk it all. I'm going to go down there. And you read some of his other quotes, and he was recognizing that Texas was this great opportunity for people. He's like, Texas is like a Garden of Eden. I'm like, sometimes. Depends on which part of Texas you go to, obviously. But he recognized there was something worth fighting for in Texas. Now, at the risk of turning Davy Crockett into some sort of savior figure, I want to also say that he made some mistakes along the way. He messed up, just like you and I. But the one thing that we can look at in this man's life and say, yeah, that's worth admirable, that's worth following, is the the fact that he was willing to take a stand. He knew what he stood for. And he was willing to lay down his life for that. The fact is that nowadays, everybody has something that they want to stand for. It's political season, apparently all the time now in the world. It's like an election ends and immediately you start getting ready for the next election, no matter what it is. And so there's a lot of people who come out and they're like, this is what I stand for. I'm a staunch Democrat. I'm a staunch Republican. I'm a big independent. I'm a libertarian. I'm the Green Party. I'm whatever there is. And all these people come out and they devote so much of themselves and so much of their time and their energy to their politics. And that's admirable. They know what they stand for. I respect them for that, even if I don't agree with their stance all the time. People come out and say, I want to fight strong for the poor. I want to do things that matter to them. I want to fight for their protection. I want to eliminate poverty. I want to go to foreign countries and fight famine. I want to do those things, and I stand for that, and that's great. Some people stand for family. Some people stand for making money. Some people stand for a lot of different things. But at the end of the day, I ask you, is there anything that we stand for that we're worth dying for? That we're willing to risk it all for? Now, I have my political beliefs. I'm not willing to fight for them. In fact, I've reached the point where I'm not even going to talk politics with people anymore. I've realized that it divides us so very much that if I say I am this particular brand of politician, I've immediately alienated somebody who disagrees with me. So if you want to know what I believe, get to know me well enough that our relationship matters more than my political preference and yours. I don't want to fight for that anymore. The truth is that I really wish I could say I was willing to stand up and fight against poverty and famine and all that kind of stuff. And it bothers me and I want something to be done about it, but it's not where I take my stand. I'm not willing to risk it all for that. I don't think that makes me a bad person because that's not my calling. Now, if it's your calling and you say, I really don't want to go through that, then that's between you and God. But for me, that's not what I stand for. I don't stand for healthcare. I don't stand for my job necessarily. I enjoy my job. I love my job, but I don't stand for it. I definitely don't stand for making money because my job is teaching and there's just not money there. I don't stand for a lot of things. In fact, at the end of the day, when I look at my life, I ask myself, what do I stand for? And like the song said, I don't know. I mean, there was a time that I stood for this church and believing it, and I do, but I struggle lately with that. I get tired. I don't know about you, but it's easy to get burned out even with something you love. And I'm right there on that burned out level, tired. It's a fight sometimes. And so I begin to question, do I really stand for this anymore? Does this really matter to me? And it was starting to concern me to the point where I said, all right, God, you've got to wake me up. You've got to ignite that fire in me. You've got to help me to understand what you're calling me to, or I'm done. I could walk away from it. And so I started reading Nehemiah. And if you're like, well, that's an awfully random book to read, but I remember hearing from people in the past that Nehemiah is a great book on leadership. It's a great book about a guy who rallies people together and gets them to stand for something. And so I started reading Nehemiah, and I love Nehemiah. I love what he does. And so we're going to spend tonight and next Sunday talking about Nehemiah and things he goes through. And I'm really excited about next Sunday as well, because next Sunday is kind of what God smacked me between the eyes with today, of when you're burned out, when you're tired, asking God for strength. In the midst of all the junk that's being thrown at you, that's how you stand. And that's next week. But before we get there, we've got to figure out what Nehemiah is all about. So we're going to kind of generalize the story, but we'll have some scripture that we're going to throw up there here in just a second that we'll get some specifics. And so we'll start with Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1, because that's the beginning of the story. Nehemiah kind of had a Davy Crockett moment and kind of looked around and he said, man, I need to go to Jerusalem. And I need to do something about it. I need to know what's happening there, and I know that what's happening there is bad, so I got to be there. This is what it says. It says, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Nehemiah is talking about his brothers and his sisters and his family and his culture that had been exiled because an invading army came in and whipped Jerusalem. Now, they whipped Jerusalem because Jerusalem had stopped following God. They'd stopped paying attention to what the Father was telling them to do. They'd stopped listening. They'd started following other gods. They'd given up. They'd burned out on religion, and they'd burned out on God, and they quit following Him. So the exile was God's punishment, but it was also God's second chance to remind them that the rest of the world is not as good as you had it. These other gods that these other nations follow, they're not good. They're not me. When Nehemiah is confronted with the fact that his homeland, his holy land, his picture of his holy place was in ruins and destroyed, it broke his heart. See, I believe for all of us, whatever it is that God is calling us to take a stand for, we only recognize that's our stand when we find ourselves weeping, mourning, fasting, being broken over what we hear. When we first came to here, when God first planted in our heart the desire to come to the gate, that's how it began with me. I literally imagined reaching college students at Texas A&M on North Gate, and I began to weep, and my heart broke for them. But over the years, I've lost sight of that. Over the years, the emotion and the feeling, and let me say this, emotion is important. A lot of people will say, don't let your emotions get in your way of your faith. That is completely and totally wrong. God uses our emotions to stoke fires in our hearts. Now we have to temper that emotion with wisdom and knowledge of what God would have us to do, but do not be Christian robots. Let God move in your heart. And if that means that you are emotional and you get excited or you cry or you're happy and you're joyful or whatever, let the Spirit lead you in that too. Nehemiah did. He heard these things, he sat down and he wept, and for some days he mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. I want to ask you this. Is there anything in your life right now that breaks your heart? Is there anything that you look around and you see and you say, I cannot abide that going on. I need to do something about it. Like I said, it's a political world now. A lot of people are standing up and saying, well, there's things I don't like, and so I'm going to stand up and I'm going to fight for it. I'm going to defend my candidate, whoever he or she may be. That's great, but that's not eternal. It's not lasting. Regardless of who wins the election in November, and regardless of whether they destroy our country or save it, God doesn't change. There are still things of need in our world that no politician and no government on earth will fix or make right. So what is it? What is it for you that keeps you up at night? What is it for you that is your broken down walls and burned gates? What is it for you? Going on in Nehemiah chapter 2, Nehemiah has gone and he talks to the king, because Nehemiah is a cupbearer for the king, and what that basically means is to drink and sample the food of the king to make sure it's not poisoned. So Nehemiah's whole job is to sort of be a taste tester, but if it doesn't taste good, he dies. So it's a really important taste tester job. He asked the king for help. And this is what happens. It says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when the wine was brought before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. I think that's important. Can people tell a difference in you when you are impacted by something? The fact that Nehemiah makes a point to say, hey, look, I've been serving the king for a while and he'd never seen me sad. His personality how he lived his life had already impacted the king. So the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? He is saying this to the king who caused this, or at least a king in the line of people from the nation who caused these things. He is basically saying, you destroyed my homeland. Your people destroyed my homeland. To the guy who holds his life in his hands. If you don't recognize that that is him taking a major stand already and saying, look, my heart is broken for my people. I have earned the right in your presence. I have served you faithfully. I've done well. All that's implied in what we see here so far. Then I'm going to speak out. If you don't want to see me sad, let me do something. The king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. And this is the key thing. Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. The first thing you got to do when you take a stand is you got to be willing to take that first step. And for some people, that first step is a very simple thing. It's like, okay, I'm going to go. But for other people, that first step is putting your life on the line. Nehemiah put his life on the line. He threw his neck out there and he said, I want to go and rebuild my city. And what's important for us to see here is that up to this point, Nehemiah had lived in such a way that he could impact positively the king. He had earned the king's respect. One of the things you'll hear me say often here is that I don't want to tell people about the sin in their lives until I have earned the right to do that. I don't want to stand up in front of them and somebody I just met and say, man, you really ought to stop doing that because that dishonors God. Because the first thing they're going to do is stop listening. But if I have lived a life and I have shown that I care about them, if I've shown that I care about who they are as a person, and I've never brought up their sin, I've never brought up their failings, I've never pointed that out, I've never been that guy, and I earn their respect, then I put my life on the line and I say, here's the deal. This is the struggle. Now, if you know somebody, if you meet somebody and they're doing something, they're committing some sin that's dangerous to your life, then yeah, go ahead and jump that one. But if it's, hey, you really should stop cussing, or hey, you really should stop drinking a little too much, hey, you should stop sleeping around, unless you've earned that right, they're going to shut you down and the conversation's over. But Nehemiah had built that up. He had built himself up in the life of the king, in the eyes of the king. So when he asked him to do this thing, to go and rebuild a conquered city, which other kings would look at and say, this is an act of rebellion, this is an act of you trying to build up and to fight back. But Nehemiah asked and the king answered. Are you living such a life so that when the time comes for you to take a stand, the path will be open? Or are you just being somebody casually pushed around, living your life, doing your own thing, not living a life of integrity? Because here's the thing, if you want to take a stand, you got to be ready for what comes next. You got to be ready for the opposition. You got to be ready for all sorts of trials. And if you've been living without integrity, it's going to be real easy to walk away when things get hard. Moving on to Nehemiah. Nehemiah heads out. It says, he gets to Jerusalem and he goes around, he takes a look at some things and he sees what's going on. He sees just how bad things are and they're worse than he thought. And he says in verse 17, then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and we will no longer be in disgrace. There's a lot of talk right now about the Middle East. And as always, Jerusalem is at the center of things. It is the holy city for Christians, for Jews, and for Muslims. And And there is wars and there is bloodshed over specific spots. Because that city is so important to those three religions, it is at the center of wars since time began. It is going to be at war, and it always will be, because of things like this. Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, that we will no longer be in disgrace. I'm not going to stand here tonight and tell you it's just a city. I'm a believer that God is with his people, and it doesn't matter. Cities don't matter, buildings don't matter, but Jerusalem matters. For whatever reason, I can't explain it, but in the scriptures, Jerusalem's important. It matters. It matters to both those three religions. It matters to individual people. And it's personal. Nehemiah didn't just get upset because Jerusalem was broken down. Nehemiah got upset because it was personal. When you take a stand, it has to be personal for you. It has to be personal. Because if it's not, it's too easy to walk away when it gets tough. It has to be a part of your heart. Blood needs to be shed, whether it's metaphorically or literally. Blood needs to be shed for what you take a stand for. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. So he says, hey, let's build the city back up. And the people said, all right, let's go, let's build. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you were doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? See, there you go. There's already opposition. They haven't even picked up one stone. All they've said is, let's go. We're willing to take a stand. We're willing to fight for this. We're willing to do this because it breaks our hearts. And people say, it's not going to happen. I've told the story before, but when we started the gate, I was talking to another believer, another pastor, and I said, so, what do you recommend? This is what our church is. We're a church that wants to be built around college students and be able to reach college students, but also be led by college students. And he looked at me and he said, it can't happen. It'll never work. And I heard that and I thought, but what about believing that God can do things? What about believing that God can do things that you've not seen before? If you take a stand, even people you love and care about will not understand that. It's going to happen. But even more so, people who want you to fail, for whatever reason, the knives will come out. And it will be an all-out fight. And this isn't going to be the last we hear about Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. These guys pop up again in the Nehemiah story. Actually, we'll talk about them more in detail next week. But then Nehemiah answered by saying, I answered it by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim of historic right to it. As I was reading this, I was reminded of Jerusalem. And I was reminded of our conflicts today that are over the same issue. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you one way or another what I think should happen, but I just want you to understand that it's personal. The issues in the Middle East, it's about religion, but it's personal. And every stand you take is personal, if it really matters. And to the people who are not willing to go with you on your stand, who are not willing to fight with you on the journey you're going on, the people who are not willing to uproot their lives and go to Texas to fight for freedom, you're essentially pulling a Davy Crockett here and saying, you know where you can go, because I'm going to Texas. That's what Nehemiah says. You guys, take off. I'm rebuilding Jerusalem. And you won't have any part in what happens. And when it's done, it's going to be awesome. That's what taking a stand is about. So Nehemiah begins to build the wall. And a beautiful part of the story of Nehemiah has nothing to do with Nehemiah, but has everything to do with the people who get up and start building the wall. And they all do. If you read it, it's kind of, if you just glance at it, it's kind of dry reading. But in Nehemiah chapter 3, it begins to relate all the people who worked on the wall. And it's sort of like when you read the genealogies, in Genesis and Numbers and all that stuff, and you're just like, oh, 50 names that all look the same and none of which I can spell. All of them in a row. And that's kind of what this is, but it also tells a story. And I picked out 3 of them that I want us to look at tonight. The first one that we looked at is in verse 5 of chapter 3. It says 2, chapter 3. It says the next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. That one jumped out to me. Because a lot of times what happens is the really important people don't do anything, but they want to reap the benefits. The great stands, the great fights in history for freedom, for religion, for whatever, they're not fought by the powerful people. They're fought by people like us. They're fought by the people who do it because it's personal, because we need it, because something in our soul is dying unless we do it. The nobles of Tekoa, they wanted the security, and they wanted the comfort, and they wanted the restoration, but they weren't willing to put out the work. If you believe in something, are you willing to fight for it? Are you willing to work for it? Are you willing to put your shoulders to the work? If it matters. Shallum, son of Halohesh, ruler of half district of Jerusalem, repaired the next section with the help of his daughters. On the surface, that's cool. It's a family affair. But deeper, you realize women were getting out and working on a wall. They were putting their shoulders to the work. No one was going to say to them, but you can't do this because you're a woman. And in that time, most of the time people would say, you can't do this because you're a woman. But it mattered enough to them to buck societal norms, to go against what everybody was expecting and work on a wall. Their cause was important to them. Important enough for them to get out and build, regardless of what everybody else thought about it. The last one is, next to him, Baruch, son of Zabai, zealously repaired another section from the angle to the entrance of the house of Eliashib, the high priest. He zealously repaired it. Guys, when you stand for something, it's got to be zeal. There's a quotation from Isaiah where it's applied to Jesus. It said, zeal for your house consumes me. And that verse is applied to Jesus when Jesus is beating people up outside of the temple because they were taking money instead of worshiping God. He makes whip out a hair and he beats people because zeal for his house consumed him. When was the last time you went after anything with zeal? I ask that question to myself a lot. When was the last time I went after anything with zeal? When was the last time I looked at the gate with zeal? And I'm going to be really honest, and a lot of you have heard me talk about this before. I am still, and I have for a long time, struggled with being on fire for doing this. I believe in what the mission of this church is. But I also believe that I cannot be at this by myself. I included this stuff up here tonight because I wanted to point out to you that Nehemiah taking a stand was awesome, but unless other people took that same stand, took those same commitments with him, it would not have succeeded. Nehemiah never would have rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, the wall of Jerusalem, if he tried to do it by himself. And I think I have always struggled with this in my life, of doing things by myself. And there's a lot of things in Christianity, this is kind of going against common tradition, there's a lot of things in Christianity you can do by yourself. But leading a church is definitely not one of them. Being a church is definitely not one of them. The stand that we have to take is as one, as a church. We've got to figure out what we mean, what we stand for. One of the things we wanted to be was a church that was a missions church, and to be really honest, we have blown that one for 4 years now. We talked about it. We haven't lived it. I want that to change. I mentioned that we're going to be doing the Service Sunday meeting. The first one we're going to do is a prayer walk, and I think we're going to do it that way because we need to be praying about what the needs are around us. But I want it to be a monthly thing where once a month we do Service Sunday. We're not here in a church or a bar just soaking up some Spirit of God stuff. I want to spend at least one Sunday a month where we're going out and sharing God with people. What that means is that I need ideas. I need things that you personally are passionate about. I need areas that you want people to be reached in so that we can start going as a church and serving. I think it's funny that over the last 2,000 years, when people say, I'm going to church, we all know what that means. That means we're going to go and sit and listen to music and listen to God talk, and then we're done. But what if going to church means that we're going to go out and we're going to tell people about Christ? Or we're going to go out and we're going to sit down with somebody and while they're having a beer and just talk to them about their life and connect with them. Or maybe it means that we're going to go and we're going to collect food to take to the food pantry. Or maybe it means we're going to walk around and pray for the very people we're trying to reach. And that's what going to church is. I need to personally remember the brokenness that I felt for your generation when this started. And the very fact that your generation had so much spirituality. But I was seeing so many of you graduate from high school and disappear from the church. That's what broke my heart originally. What broke my heart was realizing that Texas A&M right now, there's over 50,000 students at Texas A&M, but on any given Sunday, there's less than 15,000 in church. Throw Breakaway in there, and you still aren't even to 20,000 people going to church on a weekly basis out of 50,000. And we are a conservative school. Let's broaden that to the community. Bryan College Station is growing. Expectations are that by 2030, it will be 250,000 people between Bryan and College Station. That's a lot of people. Considering that right now, we're sitting at about 150,000, 160,000. On any given Sunday, how many of them are connecting with Christ in any way, shape, or form? Here's the stand I want to take. I want to take a stand that church isn't about us gathering here. So that if someday we aren't able to meet at Hurricane Harry's anymore, that doesn't mean the gate stops being a church. I want us to be a church that reaches out to people. I want us to be a church that doesn't just talk about reaching out to people, but goes to the people. But I want to believe, again, that my God is big enough to do whatever we ask, as long as it's in His name. But I know I can't do it alone. I need your encouragement. Not, hey, good speech tonight, Chad. But I need encouragement in seeing you seeking Christ. And I realize that my responsibility in that is that you need to see me seeking Christ. I can't expect you. I can't demand of you anything that I'm not willing to do myself. I don't want to be one of the nobles who is standing back going, man, I want you guys to build this church while I just, do whatever. I want to be the guy who zealously repairs another section. I want to be in there with you. So I ask you to pray for me. That if I'm going to lead this church, that I would have the boldness to take a stand again in my own spiritual life. And I want you to, as you finish praying for me, I want you to pray for yourself, that you would have the boldness it takes to take a stand in your spiritual life. I'm tired of walking around and going, what do I stand for? Most nights I don't even know. I don't know if you're struggling with that tonight or not. And if you're looking for a reason to stand for something, if you're looking for something to matter in your life, me too. Let's find it together. Let's seek Christ. As hard as it may be, as dry as sometimes those times with God seem to be, let's get together and let's seek Him. Through times like tonight, through service Sundays, through the fellowships, through meeting one-on-one, through you sending a message through Facebook or an email or whatever saying, hey, pray for me, I need help, this is what's going on, hey, how's this going? Challenging me, Chad, how's your day going? You struggling with anything today? How's your walk going? I want that to be our lives. If you're willing. It's not easy building a city that's been destroyed. It's not easy revamping a church. It's not easy to follow Christ with passion every single day. But I've done it before, and it was amazing. And I don't want to go back to that. I want to do something new. I want to do something fresh. I want my relationship with God to mature instead of regress. Even if regressing means going back to a really cool time, because it won't be as good as what I'm growing into. The stand I want to take is to find Christ again. I want to find Him in reading His Word and praying and in serving Him and in loving other people as He loved other people. That's the stand that's worth taking. Let's pray.